Oh, okay, so I think that we are live and ready to go for this afternoon's keynote. This is kind of the culmination of a workshop that we've been putting together with the environment page on Jadalia on new perspectives on environment, politics, and capitalism. And it is my pleasure to introduce for our keynote this afternoon, Dr. Munira Khayyat, who teaches anthropology at New York University at Abu Dhabi. She is the author of A Landscape of War, Ecologies of Resistance and Survival in South Lebanon, which was published with the University of California Press in 2022. Her writing has appeared in American Ethnologist, Public Culture, JMU's Cultural Anthropology, Anthropology News, HAU, and a number of edited volumes. And Khayyat was a member of the School of Social Science at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton between 2018 and 2019. Before joining NYU Abu Dhabi in 2023, she taught at the American University in Cairo and the American University in Beirut. She holds a PhD in cultural anthropology from Columbia University, and her talk today is titled Resistant Ecologies in a Landscape of War, Lessons from South Lebanon, and it draws on her work in South Lebanon to show how a landscape approach to lived world in a region pierces through unhelpful political boundaries, borders, and categories to illuminate more generative understandings and hopefully a better politics. We reflected this morning during our workshop how odd it is to have an event that feels quite normal right now. And I think that when Munira shared with us all the title of her talk, we felt that it was incredibly timely for this week. And I'm going to quote my co-editor here, Gabby Kirk, with an email that she sent me last night, but that this feels in a week of chaos and kind of an inability to wrap our heads around what's happening, that this talk provides us with a salve of trying to think about how to approach the events unfolding. And I just want to acknowledge that you've written this over this past week, which has been incredibly difficult. And so we want to thank you so much for joining us here today. And we really look forward to hearing what you have to share with us. Thank you.
Thank you so much to Marlena and to the whole wonderful team. And it also, I mean, the workshop today was extremely inspiring, kind of a lovely space to sort of be together in these difficult times. I wanted to ask if I could show up a PowerPoint, and if not, I can easily go without it, but I have some nice images I can share, but probably that might be a bit difficult if I can't do it.
Yes, you should have permission to share your screen now, and feel free to let me know if it doesn't work.
Right, I'll do that then. Can't seem to do it.
You have sharing rights, so
I don't know why I'm not able to see. Okay. Oh, I have to do all right, I got it. It's my computer's problem. Right. Sorry for that. I have to quit and rejoin. I'll be back in a sec.
Totally fine.
Okay, I'm back now and I'm gonna try. Okay, it works now. Great. Can you all see my PowerPoint?
Yes.
Great.
Yes, you're perfect.
Okay, great. Okay, thank you so much to everybody, and thank you for having me. So there couldn't be a more timely moment than right now to ask difficult questions about environment, capitalism, the nation state, and politics. And the papers that we heard today have productively investigated such questions across a diversity of entry points and terrains. I've listened and I've learned a lot from kindred disciplines and spirits today. I find that one of the more generative places to explore the destructive convergences of capitalism, the nation state, and politics is war, which, far from being an exotic, exceptional, and merely destructive phenomenon, is actually constitutive of these structures and processes, in short, of the world we live in. In my work, I've been advocating for investigating war alongside normalized processes and formations, such as capitalism and the nation state. Indeed, war is an inseparable dimension of these, and some theorists argue that war is the nation state's raison d'etre. So why has war, an all too real living environment for too many, been pushed into the shadows, both geographically and in scholarship and theory? The answer is clear. War is treated as other because war is not an ordinary living environment in what is thought of as the heart of empire. War, a savage condition, thrives at civilization's exotic edges. Of course, it's necessary for us to problematize its geography, its attendant qualifying adjectives and trenchant binaries, and thus to decolonize our understandings of war by placing its ravaged living environments at the heart of our understandings of the world that capitalism, colonialism, and the nation state have made. To decolonize war is to bring these apparently disparate or opposed realities into the same frame or landscape, namely, to insist that war is a constitutive pillar of the normative, not an exception, is to recognize it alongside the nation state and capitalism's unlivable and violent structural realities in which too many strive to make lives, and many do. I approach war as environment through the medium and method of landscape, an analytical frame that emphasizes structure, environment, and encompasses ecologies, a variety of vitalizing relations, basically that which is at hand to those of us who have no choice but to live in unlivable worlds. War is not a thing of exotic elsewheres. We can see from the images that have dominated our media feeds, shattered our hearts, and tormented our souls, but also, perhaps, kindled a crazy hope over the past days. War is a place where many must live and where so many continue to die. And as has been made amply clear, war is a place that can also unexpectedly paraglide into our supposedly secure and stable worlds to tragically disrupt our dance parties and invade our homes, our complacency, and our ability to think calmly and objectively about such matters. For what is this calm and collected objectivity apart from a measure of political distance from these wretched living worlds? Not many spared a thought or a heartstring for the ongoing siege of Gaza and of Palestine before this week. Thus, we must urgently attend to this moment, its horror, its hope, and its lessons to become better thinkers and better fighters for a better world, shoulder to shoulder with our comrades and kin who live and die in the trenches. War is the burning topic of our world and of our time, but for many of us, it only comes into focus at certain moments, most particularly when war threatens to burst out of the controlled environment, that is, elsewhere, that it was relegated to by the great powers after the end of World War II. It's at these moments when war gets too close to home and that war becomes real to us, triggering our humanitarian impulse and rage and horror against the horrible inequality and the brutal violence of this world. The war in Ukraine, when it broke out, did that, as did the war in the former Yugoslavia. The proximity of these theaters and the recognizable humanity of their European inhabitants brought war into urgent focus momentarily. Eventually, though, even as war goes on elsewhere, it eventually fades into background noise for the most of us. For those of us who continue to live in war-ravaged worlds, this fading is impossible. The events of the past few days have appeared in event form to many of us, but what transpires in Palestine today is anything but event. What bursts into view as singular and spectacular, unprovoked acts of war, naturally enacted by those whose humanity is deeply in question, is in fact, as was famously spelt out by Frantz Fanon and is being pointed out again and again, deeply rooted in enduring structures of violence, oppression, dispossession, an ongoing illegal occupation, and dare we say it, genocide. Indeed, decolonization is not a metaphor, and violence is never a choice in deadly struggles for life, justice, and equality. Also, Palestine is not just a local affair. Palestine is emblematic of ongoing struggles everywhere against the living realities of colonialism, capitalism, and the violent borders of the nation-state system that make our world. Thus, Palestine remains at the heart of my work in South Lebanon and must remain in view for all of us who think about and care about justice, equality, and an active politics of solidarity in this world. And this is a picture that I took this May on the border with Palestine in South Lebanon. I'm a child of war, having grown up in Lebanon during what is referred to as the Lebanese Civil War that lasted from 1975 to 1991, but that included 2 Israeli invasions in 1978 and in 1982, and the subsequent massacre of Palestinians in Sabra and Shatila in September of that year. Lebanon was one of the hot theaters of what the global North calls the Cold War. I'm also a scholar of war, an anthropologist who has conducted long-term research in the enduring war zone of South Lebanon, where villagers live alongside the Israeli border, which is the last live international front of the long-standing and ongoing Arab-Israeli conflict. The inhabitants of the frontline Lebanese villages, who are mostly tobacco farmers and goat herders, have lived with seasonal war for more than 70 years. Their big, strong neighbor Israel, whose arsenal is state-of-the-art and whose way of warring is what is justified as defensive and counterinsurgent, is a master of environmental warfare. Through countless bombing campaigns targeting life and infrastructure, planting landmines, and showering the landscape with napalm, white phosphorus, and cluster bombs, not to mention the 22-year occupation of the Lebanese borderland, Israel sought, through targeting the landscape, to extinguish the possibility of life and resistance in the borderland. This style of asymmetrical warfare against those who do not qualify as beings deserving of life targets all of life and its multi-species assemblages, not just men with guns. And yet, life defiantly carries on. As an anthropologist and a lifelong inhabitant of uninhabitable worlds, I'm committed to understanding life in war. In my book, A Landscape of War, Ecologies of Resistance and Survival in South Lebanon, I look at resistant life in a world shaped by war. Resistance is a standing fight to stay alive in a world made by destruction and wrought by annihilation. So, what theory of war might be adequate to these lived realities? Given the imperial geography of war and peace, such a theory, I insist, must be a theory from the South, where war dwells. الشمس تشرق من الجنوب. The sun rises from the south. Dawn bursts over the hills of South Lebanon, Jabal Amel, or Galilee, bathing the landscape in a soft pink glow. I was up before the first light with the women of the household to harvest this morning's picking of the tobacco harvest in season for the duration of the humid summer. As the rays of the rising sun reach us bent over in the field, we straighten up, sweeping black sap-coated fingers over our brows. Shouldering the burlap sacks of fresh green leaves, we head back home to break our fast. As we settle down to a breakfast of hot, sweet tea, steaming flatbread freshly baked by Sahel, the girl's mother, Bu Sahel, their father, sits on a cracked plastic chair nearby, acknowledging but not participating in the labor. Tobacco work is the lot of women here. As we eat, we talk about what everyone talks about around here, war. Although war is never mentioned, it is present in the persistence of poverty, the absence of sons, the mined border that snakes past nearby, the hard labor of tobacco, the steady turning of the seasons, and the steadfast cultivation of life in an unlivable world. The village home of Busahel, Sahel, and their grown daughters, Khawla, Nawal, and Zahra, is a stone's throw removed from the Lebanese border with Israel, a front line of war since 1948. Since the elders were children and their children were children, war and all its attendant forms of violence has shaped their life world. Busahel was born in this tiny village in 1931 during the French Mandate, when the border between the areas of French and British control freshly separated the nascent states of Lebanon and Palestine. He was a youth during the Nakba in May of 1948, when thousands of Palestinians forced out of their villages by armed Zionists fled over the hills of Galilee and into Lebanon. Sahel recalls the refugees living in the village orchards when she was a child. The children welcomed by the village children as playmates, the adults joining in the seasonal agricultural labor. The Hajj and Haji married in the 1960s when Palestinian guerrillas known as Fida'is roamed the Lebanese borderland. The family, now with many small children, fled from their home during Israel's first land invasion of Lebanon in 1978. They lived in a Red Cross camp in the coastal city of Sur for a spell, and then moved to the outskirts of Beirut, where they, along with other displaced Southerners, built illegal homes on squatted land near the capital's only public park in the swelling Hizam al-Bus, belt of misery, surrounding the city, which is now the southern suburbs of Beirut, Dahi. A few years later, soon after the second Israeli invasion in 1982, and what would become its 22-year occupation of the borderland that lasted from 1978 until 2000, and in the middle of the what is called the Lebanese Civil War, which lasted from 1975 until 1990, Busahel and his family returned to their village. The first thing I did when I returned here is to plant fruit trees in my garden, the old Hajj says, pointing to the ground with a hand that now trembles, but with a defiant lift of his chin. I planted myself here, and I never left again. Busahel is well loved and deeply respected in the village. He's known for being idiosyncratic in his views, but always direct, honest, and fair. He shakes his head at my many earnest questions, and he sighs. Ya binti, my daughter, he says to me about the years of war, displacement, and occupation that he's lived in this place. Some things were better, and some things were worse. A murmur of muffled protest ruffles the gathering, some respectfully disagreeing with such a measured stock of desperate times. A more combative approach is generally preferred, but Busahel remains grounded, equanimous, stubborn, brutally blunt, fanning his fingers through the air and knowingly eyeing the heavens. The old Hajj describes the ongoing play of life and war as rain or shine. I conducted fieldwork in South Lebanon in the immediate and long aftermath of the 2006 July war, Harb Tammuz. In 34 days of fighting, 1,123 Lebanese civilians were killed, 30% of whom were children under the age of 13, 4,409 were injured, 15% of whom were permanently disabled. Material damage was assessed at 3.6 billion and comprised 640 kilometers of roads, 73 bridges, and 31 other targets, such as Beirut's International Airport, water and sewage treatment plants, electrical facilities, 25 fuel stations, 900 commercial structures, 350 schools, 2 hospitals, and 15,000 homes. Another 130,000 homes were significantly damaged. The Lebanese coast was contaminated by an oil slick that resulted from the bombing of the power plant in Jiyya, just south of Beirut. Its damaged storage tank seeped 15,000 tons of oil into the sea, the largest ever oil spill in the already threatened, polluted, and dying Mediterranean. Another 25,000 tons of oil burned at that plant, creating a toxic cloud that rained oil upon the beleaguered landscape. In the wake of this war, I went deep into the battlefield, following the path of destruction, and surveyed a smashed moonscape, crossing makeshift bridges and gingerly navigating crackled and cratered roads. Although Israel had unleashed the might of its arsenal to destroy and disable Hezbollah, an enemy that was not differentiated in the eyes of the Israeli war machine from the very landscape, life was already vibrantly rebounding in the rubble. I invoke here a question posed by Vina Das that echoes throughout my work on war. What is it to pick up the pieces and to live in this very place of devastation? Through tracing various strands of what I call resistant ecologies that grow in worlds of war and other modern wreckages. In my book, I consider the vitalizing relations or ecologies of practice composing a landscape of war and of living. It's their configuration, temporalities, forms, substances. It's in their configuration, temporalities, forms, substances that war is shown or brought to life in theory and writing. Outside of violence, tropes of otherness, and across unexpected times of calm. The hands of Fatima. The hands of Fatima are stained black. She sits in the heat of a July morning in a pool of bright shade under a makeshift canopy outside her home in a village in South Lebanon, 1 year after the last war, threatening tobacco. On July 12, 2006, Fatima was sitting where she's sitting now, like every morning at this time of year, when suddenly the air was pierced by the blaring of the village mosque loudspeakers. Fatima thought to herself as she continued threading that they were going to announce the results of the state school exams. Instead, it was a proclamation of that morning's capture by Hezbollah of 2 Israeli soldiers, the event that sparked what is now known as Harb Tammuz, the July War. Soon after, bombs began to rain down as the Israeli Air Force took to the skies. Fatima's husband, Hussein, was at pasture with his goats like all mornings when all of a sudden, he found himself lying on the ground, his animals scattered. Picking himself up, he gathered his herd and returned home with them, only then realizing that his hand pained him. Washing the soot off his blackened limb, he found a small piercing in the skin that continued to burn his flesh even after he had cleaned it. Hussein and his goats at pasture had been hit by a white phosphorus bomb, familiar to locals as Khayyat, the burner, a weapon that's banned by the Geneva Convention for use in civilian areas. Despite his peculiar injury and the bombs that continued to fall, Hussein and Fatima did not leave their home. Fatima could not leave her tobacco plants that were in high season and required daily picking and threading, and Hussein would not leave his 55 goats who needed his pastoral care. The couple had weathered many war storms before, having lived in the village all their lives, farming tobacco and keeping goats while bringing up 6 sons. The lively pull of their homestead that formed the entire basis of their livelihood outweighed the push of the deadly violence that had just reappeared in their lives. And so, like many across the borderland once again turned battlefield, they remained where they were, weathering another war. There are no bomb shelters across the south, despite decades of recurrent Israeli aerial bombardments. And so, like everyone else, Fatima and Hussein sheltered from the shelling in their single-level, flat-roofed village home, which, like many structures in places of gentle climate, is built to embrace the environment. Since it was a white phosphorus wound, the hole in Hussein's hand continued to smolder and only ceased consuming him when he held it underwater. The couple cowered in their home under the constant shelling. Every bomb that fell, we couldn't see or breathe from the smoke and the dust. We didn't have any windows or doors left to close. We crouched behind the cracked walls of our home as the war went on outside. Divine power is what kept us, Fatima recalls, pausing a moment in her threading to point with a tar-blackened finger straight up towards the heavens and lifting her eyes skywards. There was no light, no food or water. It was sweltering summer. Mosquitoes ate us alive, and we were unable to step one step outside. By the end of the second week of war, we were soaking semolina and tea from our larder in cold water from the well and drinking it to stay alive. During a brief lull in the fighting on July 23rd, the couple left their home in search of medical help for Hussein, who was in constant desperate pain and getting weaker. By now, the tobacco was withering on the stalk and the goats would just have to fend for themselves. We left thinking we were dead, says Fatima. Indeed, it was only when they had given up on life itself that Fatima and Hussein took the decision to abandon their plants and animals, their sources of life. The old couple walked along blasted roads and eventually reached the nearest hospital, where they found that the white phosphorus had burned Hussein's arm down to the blackened bone. His body was poisoned, and after a few days, he died. His time was up. Fatima sighs deeply with unfathomable sadness. She's very tiny, and her black-socked feet look like those of a child. Her face is smooth and almost expressionless, yet it is suffused with a mixture of resignation and sorrow. In 34 days of violent conflict with land fighting, mortars, and aerial bombardment, Fatima's village was reduced to rubble. As the final ceasefire was finally agreed, the Israeli Air Force dropped more than 4 million cluster bombs across the agricultural and residential landscapes of South Lebanon. The demining crews came to Fatima's village and began to clear the land by priority. First, the village proper and the homes, then the agricultural land. The woodland and other such areas were deemed of low priority and were not cleared. But bombs remain in the land. The deminers keep coming back, says Fatima. They say, this piece of land is now clean, and then someone finds a bomb, and so they return. 15 times they've cleared the same piece of land, but it'll never get clean. The bombs are hidden in the earth. And in order to plant tobacco, one has to dig in the soil, so one never knows. The land is dangerous now. Most of the land is dangerous now, but that doesn't stop the farmers. Fatima has seen many wars, but she says that this one was the worst because its prime target was the land that contained the entangled sources of her very being. This war was much worse than when they reached Beirut, she says, referring to the 1982 Israeli invasion. Before, they mainly killed people, but now they target the land, which is far, far worse. This time, it's clear the Israeli war machine was set on destroying the very ecologies that make life here possible. But war didn't stop those left alive. Fatima found 2 bomblets hanging from her apricot tree and harvested them herself with her own bare hands, a strange and deadly crop. But Fatima did not hesitate and didn't fear. Who still has life will not die, she says with quiet conviction, her head bowed over her tobacco. We, the people of the South, whatever happens, we hold on to the land, she says, clenching her blackened fingers into a fist. We don't have anything else. Fatima's not talking in terms of mere livelihood. There's a powerful sense of existential communion too, for these practices and their rhythms constitute her life world. You need to just sleep one night here and breathe in the air, and you'll understand, she says to me ardently. Military logic often misjudges the power of the vital sources of life and their vital relationship to both civilian and military resistance. As Ian Shaw writes about Vietnam, many believe that the US military lost the Vietnam War because of how it routinely misunderstood the importance of village life as both a wellspring of identity and insurgency. Today, a year after the last war where she lost husband, flock, and field, Fatima is threading tobacco. In fact, within hours of the final ceasefire, she was back in her home, removing bombs from her garden and nursing her dusty and shaken fruit trees back to life. As she describes a return to health, her hands momentarily leave off from threading to describe the movement of supple young branches swaying in the wind, and her face lights up briefly. When her husband died, she sold the goats, and now her life, like the lives of many across this borderland, is squared entirely upon tobacco. It'll keep her here and keep her alive. And although that source of living has been made more difficult, the difficulties are evidently neither unnavigable nor insurmountable. One could say that Fatima has found a way to continue to live with and through seasonal gusts of war, always yoked to the swift practiced time and steady income of tobacco. Fatima's unheroic and ordinary struggle to stay alive, to care for her only home in the world and her fruit trees that sometimes bear apricots and sometimes explosives, and to continue to plant tobacco in the bomb-sprinkled earth is a resistant ecology of survival in a landscape of war and devastation. Fatima and her tobacco embody a resistant ecology, a human-plant alliance, a multi-species partnership that quietly defies the destructive nature of the wars that have made their shared world. Our received understanding of war defines war as 1, as event, 2, as savagely violent to the point of social death, and 3, as exceptional and external to a Northern alliance of peace in the post-World War II global order. War from the South is 1, a structure, an environment, 2, a violence also generative of social worlds and attuned to formations of power, and 3, as much a part of this world, our world, as capitalism and the state, and just as profitable. In a place like South Lebanon, in Gaza, it's impossible to parse war and life. They're co-present, they coexist. In South Lebanon, war subjects, infrastructures, economies, technologies, geographies, and temporalities coalesce into ecologies of living in an agricultural borderland that's also a battlefield. The processes of cultivation and harvests, the profits, as well as the risks involved, are always entangled with the ongoing condition of war, despite intermittent periods of calm. This is not a matter of choice, but of survival. In this seasoned battlefield, agricultural cycles and seasons of war are interwoven, enmeshed, and together shape the lived world. Land-based livelihoods premised on known and predictable agricultural seasons and harvests, mawasim zira'iyya, are sustained across and through seasons and harvests of war, mawasim harb. Like dew upon a stalk of tobacco at dawn, my book condenses into what I call resistant ecologies, vitalizing more than human survival collectives, in Anna Tsing's phrasing, that sprout around agricultural and other practices sustaining life in frontline villages through seasons of conflict. These ecologies of practice, a hopeful and open-ended attention to subaltern life and its radical possibilities that I borrow from Isabel Stengers in South Lebanon, include ordinary arts. And I write about those in the various chapters of the book, such as cultivating the bitter crop of tobacco, the sacred olive, and traipsing with goats through deadly and delicious borderland minefields, and enshrining the landscape and honoring its resistant spirits, as well as collaborating with humans and other beings across a variety of borders to resist the necropolitics of war and occupation. Resistant ecologies describe how life-sustaining practices become with, as Donna Haraway puts it, and thus unexpectedly, to Northern theory, thrive within, as I put it, the deadly environment of war. Life and war are not ontologically opposed. My focus on life neither normalizes nor romanticizes war. Theoretically, I insist we must understand war as a part of this world, not its negation. And ethnographically, I want to show the way in which war is lived by those with no available exits. Life during the Israeli occupation was dreadfully hard, but since they were a household of 2 elders and their 3 unmarried daughters, Busahel and his family were mostly left alone. They adapted their everyday routines and rhythms to the harsh limitations on life under military occupation: curfews, restriction on movement, random searches, abductions, detentions, torture, roadblocks, military operations, bombardment, and the generalized thuggery or terror as usual of military occupation and militia rule. Busahel recalls the importance of the land to their continued presence. He says, "We'd work the land, me and the girls in the Hajj, and so we stayed in the village. Any work requires effort. أي عمل بده جهد. With flaha, plowing, one plows in the freezing and in the cold and the rain to plant the ground, and one harvests in the heat. But we chose this difficult path because we wanted to continue to live here. And it wasn't only us who stayed. Those who could stayed." During the occupation, the family, like many others in the Strip, continued to farm tobacco for the Regie, the Lebanese state-owned tobacco monopoly. One of the hardest rules to live with during the occupation was the Israelis' strict interdiction on movement from sundown to sunup, because it meant that they and all the inhabitants of the occupied Strip who depended on tobacco, the vital cash crop, could no longer harvest it in the cool, damp darkness of dawn. The Israelis would shoot anyone violating their rules. We couldn't leave the house before sunrise, and so we had to pick tobacco in the blazing heat of day. We got roasted alive. It made our hands bleed. But we did it. We had to, recalls Khawla, the eldest of the sisters with whom I am close. Harvesting in daytime was also bad for the tobacco leaves, which immediately wilted in the heat, she adds. What is bad for humans is also bad for their plants. That is clear. But together, plants and humans persisted, and in staying collaboratively alive, bitterly resisted. Resistance in South Lebanon is not a faded or false political ideology, nor is it a romantic illusion. In South Lebanon, resistance remains both a military reality and a vital existential orientation to the consuming and annihilating realities of capitalism, nationalism, and war. Locally grown armed resistance in South Lebanon successfully expelled the Israeli occupation, an unprecedented historical event. But, and this must be spelled out, the ability of life to persist in these farming villages amidst ever-returning gusts of war is also key to that resistance. Resistance is staying rooted through the thickness of adversity. Like in Palestine, in South Lebanon, we famously call it sumud. Like my friends in frontline villages, I'm convinced that resistance remains empirically, analytically, and morally illuminating about the ways in which life carries on in the battlegrounds of South Lebanon and beyond. Not only do frames of trauma, suffering, and degradation, or their opposite, resilience and endurance, fail to contain the pugnacious multi-species vitalities ensnared in necropolitical materialities that pulsate, as Christina Lyons puts it, through waves of war. But Southern villagers still proudly refer to their continuing presence in place and to their sustainable life-making practices in the face of apocalypse as resistance, muqawame. And that includes steadfastness or sumud as a kind of stubborn being. I refuse to take this from them. Resistance can be politically and analytically subsumed, and too often is, under the mantle of Hezbollah, which is referred to as the resistance al-muqawame. Through the long years of war in South Lebanon, Hezbollah today monopolizes resistance politically and militarily. But resistance is more than that. As I show in my book, Hezbollah draws on diverse homegrown and heterodox genealogies and various vernacular practices of resistance as a vitalizing source of its ongoing social and military fluency and continued political salience. So when summoned by frontline villagers in relation to their lives, Muqawame shakes free of the singular and lofty political signifier and is once again rooted, humbly rooted in life ongoing and oriented towards defiant life. It is existentially and effectively important to many villagers who are largely a vulnerable demographic of elders, women, children, the rural poor, to own the power, dignity, and praxis of resistance, muqawame, and the fight for a better world that comes with it. My insistence upon resistance as a meaningful frame for the humble and yet heroic life of war recognizes its continued local currency, returns it to the manifold histories and multiple presents, wrests it from both singular political or ideological uses, and recuperates it from the waste paper basket of scholarship. The resistance that I'm committed to, as are my friends in South Lebanon, is that which resists all-consuming and annihilating processes, systems, and analytical frames, such as the state, capital, and war. The creative, more than human fight to stay alive in such conditions, and not just despite them, is what I'm calling resistance. War is a lethal environment, and war as a lethal environment, like other lethal environments of late capitalism and the Anthropocene, must be actively resisted by all of those who live it, and it is. This flips the approach from depressing and defeatist optics of death and degradation to the hopeful attachment and commitment to defiant life against all odds. And in this vital struggle to stay alive on this doomed planet, humans are by no means alone. Resistance is rooted in diverse ecologies, which is another way of saying all kinds of relations, connections, friendships, collaborations, coexistences, the standing fight to stay alive. By carefully attending to the agency and life-making strategies innovated by all of those who have no choice but to continue to live in such deadly worlds, another theory of life and war rises from the South. In the last section of this talk, I would like to think about what it would mean to decolonize war. The challenge is to recognize, to decolonize, to unsavage war as a process coherent with our comfortable worlds. Since the end of the Second World War, with the exceptions of Northern Ireland and the Balkans and now Ukraine, wars have largely been confined to the global South. Although they are as globalized and as unequal as any process in capitalism, and apart from the unwelcome migrants and refugees that they generate, militarized conflict, hot wars, have been successfully outsourced or banished, as Hobsbawm put it, to other worlds, and hence are not immediately, experientially, and imaginatively accessible to those of us complacently inhabiting colder or more peaceful quarters, colder and more peaceful quarters in the global North. The ways in which this riven Manichaean, as Fanon calls it, reality has shaped war as a conceptual object is profound and has not been sufficiently acknowledged or adequately corrected. What would a theory of war look like that is sourced from where it is lived and not from worlds far removed from the action? Too often, war is narrated from its other imperial end. War is dominated by accounts of those who wage it, who are more often than not the agents of empire. Just think of the US wars in Vietnam and Iraq. Faceless, nameless millions of Vietnamese and Iraqis are at best irrelevant to, but mostly just absent from the dominant narratives. There's a dire need to correct this right now, to decolonize our epistemic terrain, adjust our political stakes, source our theory, and ground our ethnography in worlds and words that don't comfortably inhabit hegemonic imperial geographies and tropes. This is a tricky task for those of us deep in the heart of empire, who write too comfortably from that location, as was recently pointed out by Samar al-Balushi, Shahana Ghosh, and Madiha Tahir. And as important as decolonization is, it's hardly a new trend. Calls to decolonize through new ways of thinking and writing and scholarship have been ongoing. Yet, even as it appears that decolonization is resurgent once again, we remain deeply mired in a conceptual and ethnographic topography that is coherent and absolutely conversant with empire, as was pointed out some time ago by Edward Said, who in 1989 wrote, quote, "There's an almost total absence of any reference to American imperial intervention as a factor affecting the theoretical discussion. It'll be said that I have connected anthropology and empire too crudely in too undifferentiated a way, to which I respond by asking how, and I really mean how and when they were separated. I do not know when that event occurred or if it occurred at all." End of quote. Clearly, this event still hasn't occurred. And despite calls everywhere to decolonize everything right now, scholarship remains beholden to empire, despite its better intentions and desires. Writing from worlds where wars actually take place, I want to think and write war differently. Living in and writing and speaking from the global South, and here, of course, I would just like to say that to me, the global South is not a strict geographical location, but rather it points to worlds that have been shaped under the heavy hand of ongoing imperialism. Where wars are real-life struggles shaping being and time and driven by ongoing imperial, nationalist, and capitalist projects, contests, and interests, I insist that war, as experience, as an analytical object, must take its place alongside other more recognizable sites of destruction that many beings have little choice but to inhabit and thus contend with as part of their lot on this damaged and dying earth. War is not an elsewhere. War is here and now, and fellow beings make lives in war every day. An anthropology of war must approach this matter-of-factly, just as Southern villagers do, with an eye to carrying on, to living. Ethnography is a perfect medium for connecting these far-flung scales of power. Attending to the ways in which war-seasoned villagers in South Lebanon live with and in war allows us as analysts to grow a more careful theory of war. Sahel, the eldest son of the Hajj and Hajji, who we met earlier, says this to me. War is something that people have gotten used to, have come to live with. If you say that Israel is there on the border and that there will be wars every now and then, this is something that has come to be normal here, something like the wind. Say the wind will blow from this direction today, or there will be bombing, it's the same thing. It's a consideration that the person here will take to plant this piece of land rather than the other one in response to the direction of the wind or the bombs. For those who must live in war, resistant life carries on. While I begin in the presence of war, this is not a naturalizing move. It's an ethnographic and a political one. In my work, I want to describe life in war without rendering war as other and exotic elsewhere, a negative space where the social is shattered or suspended and violence and chaos rule. Instead, I grasp the stubbornness and coherence of life from within the lethal realities in which it grows, and I argue for an ecological, environmental, and thus decolonized understanding of life worlds of war. To ecologize war is to approach it differently, as was pointed out by Bridget Gorashi and Elena Kim in the introduction to a recent online forum to which I contributed, entitled Ecologies of War. When it is rendered from the perspective of those who must live it, war becomes more than militarized destruction viewed from afar. It becomes an environment of living. When one must exist in war, one strives with all relationships and resources available to live. To successfully stay alive is to resist the necropolitics of war and capital and empire and other ecological disasters. In his most recent book, Out of the Dark Night, Achille Mbembe defines decolonization as, quote, an active will to community, which he says is another name for what could be called the will to life. Thus, to think of life in war as rooted in resistant ecologies is not to romanticize, but rather to decolonize by counter to more common framings, insisting on the will to life in war, and that stubborn life as a source of a theory of war. Thus, we shake off war's persistent cloak of death, of exotic otherness, of singular violence, savagery, and barbarity, and insist that war must be analyzed and resisted by those who must live it, like other annihilating processes of capitalism and modernity. My work on war shapes my refusal of what Michel Rolph-Triot, my first teacher, calls anthropology's savage slot for, quote, the irreducible historical subjects, end of quote, of war. War should not be safely relegated to other worlds and conveniently forgotten about until refugees wash up on northern shores. War should be grasped as a globalized process affecting everyone on this planet, as capitalism and industry and now climate change are. War should be resisted by everyone, not just its direct victims. Through engaged ethnography grounded in an active war zone, to me, a familiar place, I want to show that war is a human experience that is continuous and coherent with the world we comfortably inhabit, even if those worlds of war appear temporarily, spatially, existentially removed from ours. It is politically relevant, especially to those of us researching, writing, and living in such worlds, to show that our ethnographic subjects are more than mere illustrations of our academic arguments and stepping stones in our storied careers. Inhabitants of war are fellow beings with whom we share this wretched earth. They are us. Their lives matter. By shining light on life in war, I want to explode the boundary between civilized and savage, to decolonize hegemonic understandings of war and peace. To decolonize war, we must source our theories from war's lived experience and not our untheorized, normalized distance from the killing fields. When we understand war as a condition emergent from the same social, political, economic, ecological processes that make our peaceful worlds, only then can we recognize our shared humanity, our collective vulnerability, our complicity, and to hopefully begin to grow a collective anti-imperial politics that can challenge this insidious, unequal ranking of life and humanity. This is what it is to decolonize in this moment. Decolonizing war has implications for all of us dwelling on a damaged planet amidst swirling, layered violent systems that we're only beginning to recognize as deeply interconnected and existentially threatened and threatening. For those who inhabit it, war is, whether they want it or not, a living environment and an ecosystem on our earth today. It is such a life world. In such a life world, one always hopes, but one can never be sure that the sun will rise tomorrow. The creative survival strategies that grow in these deadly worlds of war are the resistant ecologies that underwrite life and that sprout in all of modernity's wreckages. For a large number of those that we share this planet with, who are less fortunate than us, the end of the world is nothing new. Dawood, who lives nearby in the shadow of an Israeli outpost, sputtered in exasperation as I kept on asking him about the buried mines, while he described to me in loving detail how he cared for his beloved olive trees along the borderline. Ya binti, el-mot biriz el-insan. Daughter, death is in human livelihood. That's simply the way it is. من البحر للمطلة من هون لآخر معمر الله. From the sea to Metula, which is an Israeli settlement right across the border, from here to the very end of God's earth. Khalas, what can you do? Far from illustrating a fatalism often ascribed to peasants, the quintessential subalterns, such apparent acceptance of the realities of surviving in this place, the making do of just continuing to live here, demonstrates an active form of life-making. This is the everyday art of doing, the cultivated capacity of ordinary people on the margins of the nation state of history, the social, economic, the political, but too often at the center of violence, to navigate, inhabit, and in this way resist an always precarious, enduringly lethal terrain that remains the primary place and source of life and living. Dawood shakes his head and looks at me with dark, shining eyes, his gnarled hands tightly grasping his carved wooden cane as we sit amidst roses and grapevines and buzzing bees in his lovingly tended verdant garden, just beneath a bristling Israeli outpost, glowering on the crest of the hill above us. One hand lets go of the cane and flattens into an upturned palm for emphasis and to acknowledge the bounty of God. The main thing, ya binti, is for one to steady oneself, يهدي باله, and to live, ويعيش. Thank you.
Thank you so much. This is an incredibly powerful piece for the moment. And yeah, your commitment to defiant life is incredibly striking. So thank you so much for this talk. For those of you who are joining us on the YouTube live stream, please feel free to drop Q&A in the comment feed, which I have my eye on, and I'm going to be reading those comments out to Dr. Khayyat. I'm also joined by some members of the editorial team on the environment page. I guess I'll get us started with questions, though. One of the things that really strikes me is the relationship in this piece of, you repeatedly return to the question of the destructive forces of capital, and yet there seems to be a way, there's a dependence on tobacco as well as this incredibly capitalistic crop. And you talk about the ways that profit and risk are entangled in war. And you also mentioned the way that this is a vital cash crop. And so I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit about this relationship between capitalism and subsistence as processes that have become deeply entangled.
Thank you, Marlena, for that question, and also for the opportunity to speak more about tobacco, which is kind of the backbone, in a way, of both the region, but also of my book. In one of the chapters of the book entitled "The Bitter Crop," I talk about the ambiguities and the sort of the contradictions, let's say, that are embedded or embodied in this resilient and resistant crop. It's literally called نبتة المقاومة, which is like the crop of resistance, and it's also called النبتة المرة, the bitter crop, by those who plant it, because it symbolizes poverty. Basically, I mean, it's the last recourse of the most downtrodden of the Lebanese, those captured, let's say, within the Lebanese state, who were thrown this lifeline as a sort of a compromise between the power mongers of the state and their constituents, and it has been an ongoing struggle, gaining ground. I mean, those who planted the crop historically were the poor fallahin of the Jnub of South Lebanon. It's a state monopoly, so they farm it for the state, and the farmers are given a license that basically allows them to plant a certain amount, and then guarantees them an income at the end of the tobacco year for their labors. Now, tobacco itself, as a plant, is a remarkable creature. It's a plant that has a very brief flourishing in the summer. It is planted in the spring, and then it flourishes between in the months of high summer, and it's harvested over the summer. It's a green stalk, and it's harvested. It's from the bottom up. And it's mostly worked by village-dwelling families in the borderlands, the highlands of Jabal Amel or Galilee, and it's one of those balik crops that requires no irrigation. It thrives off of the dew of dawn, so it needs no infrastructure. It needs domestic labor, which is abundant in these impoverished areas, and mostly the people who work tobacco are the women and the children of the households, because men are often elsewhere, either pursuing jobs overseas or in the cities, or fighting wars. So tobacco has this really remarkable capacity to both symbolize life and its degradation. And I refuse to collapse those things onto each other. I insist on holding them in tension in the ways in which people sort of hold on to tobacco as it gives them life, even as it is part of a system that exploits them and extracts their labor and keeps them poor, right? And so it's a really, it's a remarkable crop and a relation to the larger structures of capitalism that really gives a texture to the ways in which people navigate, right? Annihilating destructive, extractive systems, but still find a way to live within it. So the Southerner will not let go of tobacco because tobacco gives them life, right? But also they would really much rather, if they could, right, let go of tobacco. And those who are living in the frontline villages right along the border of occupied Palestine, they can just look over the fence and see all of these, luscious fruit trees that are planted in those, regimented orchards across the border. And then a lot of the settlements that are right on the border have, refrigerated warehouses, and there are all kinds of sort of, wage labor systems, exploited wage labor systems that actually allow people, that allow this agriculture to thrive within the north of occupied Palestine. So for them, it would be wonderful to be able to plant trees, but the trees are often sort of targeted in war, in particular in worlds where the landscape is considered a partisan, right, to resistance or to guerrilla action, right? So trees are considered suspect by being because they provide provide shelter, right, to fighters. So as much as they would love to be able to plant trees, they can't. Also, whenever wars blow through, if an orchard is destroyed, it's something that a local farmer cannot recover from financially, but they would be easily able then, if their tobacco crop is destroyed, it's hard, but they can easily then replant it in the following season, right? So the tobacco plant itself it represents stability because of its marketability in a larger in a global system of agribusiness, right, and exploitative labor regimes and structures of inequality and poverty that sort of force people to work these crops rather than sort of branch out into more diversified forms of agriculture. In South Lebanon, and I'm going to wrap up because there's so much to be said about tobacco, but I just want to say in South Lebanon, prior to the advent of wars, there was a big subsistence agricultural economy that were every household had a sahra connected to their house, which is like a flat piece of land connected to their house where they would plant subsistence crops. But with the advent of more insecurities, people relied more and more on the sort of reliability, right, of capitalism, of the cash crop, and so subsistence agriculture started to dwindle, right? But as all of you must know, in Lebanon today, there's been a financial collapse, and monetized economies have become less and less, credible and absolutely unreliable. And one interesting development that I would love to sort of see investigate more of is that in the last 2 years, after years and years of holding on to tobacco as like the only lifeline or sort of stability, in the South Lebanon area, it's no longer viable because of the collapse of the currency, that people are now for the first time diversifying again, and some people are planting sesame, for example, because they can make better money off of it. So this is the development that I find actually kind of interesting, how with the sort of uncertainties of capitalism, you have a return to a more diversified agriculture in the region. But still, they're not letting go of their licenses because of the structure of sort of income that those provide.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. And I think we saw moments of that in your talk, especially in the moment where you described woman going out and shaking the dust off of her fruit trees. And so I also just really appreciated the texture of language and storytelling that you were able to bring to this. I just saw my co-editor Camille hop on video, so I'm assuming she has a question. I'm going to pass it over to her.
Thank you, Marlena. Thank you so much, Munira, for this talk, and also for the answer that you just gave, Marlena, which I think really clarified for me some of the ways that you're thinking about war and ecologies of war as being present in global structures of capitalism. I mean, just in a kind of like very, very everyday way. So I have two questions, one of which is maybe better articulated than the other one, and both of which also kind of call back to the workshop. So I'm sorry for anyone who's watching who didn't see the workshop, who wasn't at the workshop. But the first one is about gender, because you mentioned a couple of times that both tobacco work is gendered female, and most of the people doing the work are women and children, or especially girls, and also that the landscape itself, like men are missing from the landscape. And so I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit more about this ecology as a gendered one, and like how that plays out. And then the other thing that the question that's a little bit less articulated is, you know, this kind of question of the present, like war as being present in everywhere, even as it's relegated to certain places, but also war is, I think you said war is here and now, and you know, kind of present tense is something that is both temporal and spatial. You know, you used a bunch of other temporal language, right? Thinking about seasons of conflict and seasons of agriculture, thinking about continuity and sumud, and yeah, I don't know. So especially given that we talked earlier today about futures and about growth and change in the present, I was wondering if you just had any thoughts about kind of temporality and how to think about or how people are thinking about their present and their future in this landscape. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much, Camille. Really wonderful questions. And I also appreciate sort of thinking with the amazing workshop that I attended this morning, and the really rich work that I heard and learned from. So the first question is about women and their labor in the tobacco industry, and it's a remarkable thing. It's really, I mean, at the same time that it's the work of the poor and it's the work of, you know, those who stay behind, those who can't easily enter the labor market, right? It's also a very, like, I mean, for many groups of demographically, like, you know, depressed and impoverished, you know, sections and sectors, let's say, in Lebanon, the South is the only place where you actually have, you know, women have recourse to a form of labor that is empowering to them because of, you know, the limitations of life in that region. So it's not something that, you know, it's something that took shape throughout the years of war in the region, where families were big, and men from an early time had to emigrate. So South Lebanon, the emigration, I mean, started in droves, right? Right as the Lebanese state was invented, right? When the borders were drawn between Palestine and Lebanon, suddenly South Lebanon found itself cut off from its hinterland and also from Syria. So South Lebanon was a space where networks of trade linked the coastal cities of Palestine to the interior, which is now which was Syria today, right? So borders came and like truncated this area and created structures of created like devastation amongst the people who were living there. Also, there's a sectarian dimension to that. Most of the people who live in these areas are Shia, and when the Lebanese state was created, the Shia were also severely dispossessed and underprivileged by way of representation. Anyway, the point that I'm trying to make is that through those like historical structures of you know, poverty, inequality, dispossession, women came to sort of be, women and their children came to be the ones who held, right, down the fort as men traveled abroad. I mean, many went to Africa. There was a huge emigration also to Australia and other places of the world, but Africa was the main place. So they would be working. I mean, they would be living at home, and working in tobacco. And then when war heated up in the area, also men became enrolled in the fighting. They also, the women, their roles as the sort of the holders of the homestead, it came into much more critical sort of presence. And the thing that I try to do, or I try to sort of highlight in my work, is actually that you can't really isolate, right, the military resistance that is sort of like, always in view when you look at South Lebanon, and the sort of the work that is done that actually allows those homesteads to relatively thrive, right, within really inconceivably difficult circumstances. So the work of the women in cultivating both this crop and the children in cultivating this crop, but also in cultivating children and sort of keeping homes within a sort of like a direct sort of policy of annihilation, right, on behalf of the aggressor, which is Israel in this case. Is one of the ways in which people sort of resist, right? And so my theory of resistance is one that actually breaks out of militarized resistance, but that also centers the role of women as like a necessary, right, to resistance. So in South Lebanon, it's often, when the invaders enter, they have all this advanced machinery, but then they enter the villages, and it's a dense kind of like urban environment, right? Where the aggressors or are at a disadvantage, and so the people who are actually providing and sheltering, right, the fighters, are often those who are maintaining households in this region. So women's labor is really, really key, both to, I mean, economic and sort of just, economic survival in these regions, but it's also a key factor in the successful military resistance in South Lebanon. And I mean, South Lebanon is remarkable because it's the only place where an Israeli occupation has ended. In hopes that in other places this occupation will end too. And the other question that you asked was about time, and this one I think is part of the ways. And I mean, so I use landscape as a framing, but landscape for me isn't this like frozen frame where you have like a sort of peasants in the field harvesting the crops. But it's a way in which you can actually sort of like widen, right, a frame of analysis to include all the disparate elements, right, that sort of go into sort of making life in these regions. So in South Lebanon, it was kind of an easy, frame, because when you go to South Lebanon, I mean, this is the land of Galilee, right? I mean, it's this beautiful, overwhelmingly sort of a present landscape that just jumps into your heart, into your eyes, and so you have to think with it, right? But I mean, landscape itself as an analytical frame is to actually incorporate space and time and to insist on structure, right, rather than event when thinking about war. So this is why I utilize poetical, if you want, or sort of ethnographic sort of narratives that really bring in sort of the lived dimensions of these worlds of war, in order to sort of push us away from thinking of war only in terms of violence, only in terms of destruction, and only in terms of an event that bursts onto the scene and then is gone again. So if we think in terms of time, we're really thinking about the strategies, the way of people navigating, the way they are living with, right, war, rather than dying because of war, right? So nobody wants to die, and even in spaces of war and other annihilating, structures, people are striving to live. And so it shifts the focus to the ways in which people try to live in these worlds. And I think that this is really important because for the majority of of us, we don't live in those worlds, and we don't know what it is to be in these spaces. So I try as much as I can to sort of invoke or sort of like describe the concerns, right, of people who are living in those worlds, and to show also, I mean, to hark back to Marlena's question about tobacco, also the contradictions, right, of struggling for life in spaces of annihilation. And the other point that I try to do through looking at time and space in thinking about war, and this is kind of like a really large sort of aspect of my project, which is to put war alongside other worlds that we're more like capable of recognizing as livable. Oh, we can live under capitalism. Oh, you know, we can live under in spaces of contaminated spaces. Oh, the world, I mean, climate change is going to, you know, bring the end of the world. We can get that, right? But for many people, they can't really understand just how it is to inhabit a sort of a landscape that is contaminated by human annihilating ordinance. You know, I mean, it's the stuff in the land where you make your life is where objects are hidden that want you to die. So how do you go about doing that, and how do you kind of, I mean, I want to normalize and not just say that it's okay, but to actually allow people to recognize how people go about resisting that or overcoming that or living with that. So yeah, that's kind of in response to the second question.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Gabby, it's all you.
Hi. Thank you so much for that. I am really grateful that you came. I'm really grateful that you allowing us to record this so I can go and take more and more notes, and so that I can share it out with other people that you know, whether they're here today or not. I wanted to pick up where you left off at the end there. I guess my question is more, it's a word you didn't use today, but it's a word that has been on people's lips this week, which is this concept of inevitable, or the inevitability of war and violence. Because I'm struck by so many things, but I was struck in the concept of like not just dying, but living under war. And also that when you said, and Camille picked up on it, that war has seasons to it. And the people of South Lebanon know the seasons, and they also know the seasons of their crops, and the way that, like, in planting tobacco, there is embedded in that like a feeling of inevitability that, like, if we planted something else there, and so I'm wondering, like, what your people think of the question of the inevitability of war, and what you think of it, and also, like, what is that useful? Like, it's been such a word that's been, everyone's been talking about that, and it's just so hard for me to think about, like, when we're to this, like, I guess, unabstract it, like, there's something in, as you said, like, Lebanon teaches us that occupation can end, and I feel like when people talk about the inevitability of war against Gaza, or of people of Palestinian resistance, there's also embedded there like almost like a silencing, like a sit down and shut up, because like this will kind of just keep coming again and again and again, and it'll always have the same outcome. So I'm curious what resistance, I guess I'm looking for some hope that resistant ecologies can maybe teach us something otherwise about inevitability. So please.
Look, I mean, thank you so much, Gabby, and I think also your work speaks a lot to the ways in which people sort of inhabit those uninhabitable worlds. And so this idea of the inevitable is not so much to say that we should just shut up and, accept the fact that war is, never going to go away. But it is to sort of hold off a moment from thinking about when war is going to go away and how it's going to go away, to think about the present right now when we're living under recurrent war, right? So if we're always going to live in the hope that there's going to be peace tomorrow, right? what are we going to do about the present? I mean, for me, the politics of the present is super important. We can't focus on the future and forsake the present, right? Because the present is where life is ongoing and death is ongoing. So we need a politics of the present that is not defeatist, right? So as I'm saying, as I quoted, I'm Dawood at the end of the presentation saying, death is in our livelihood. What are we going to do? It's not a fatalistic outlook. It's like, what are we going to do? I mean, that's really the question, right? Not as an, what are we going to do? What are we going to do? We're going to plant the land. We're going to live with this, right? Even as we might die. So I really think that the inevitability should not make you think at all that we should give up. It should actually help you focus on what should be done now, right? So if you keep on thinking, I grew up in what is called the Lebanese Civil War, and they would all be like, oh, you poor children living in war, tomorrow there'll be peace and it'll be a better day, And we were like, great. So peace came, but what happened to Lebanon? Today is even worse. In many ways than the worst days of the war. So a better day might not come. And so then waiting for that better day right now, or constantly planning for that better day, is not going to make us better resistors in the present. So to just go back to your question, I think that looking at the politics of the present and also looking at the realities that people have to deal with right here and now about the with regards to the annihilating logics and realities of their world, should help us who don't live in those worlds. I partially do, but many people who don't, but who also want to help to connect, right? The annihilating circumstances of our lives under the nation state and capitalism. The worlds that we live in are not free of violence. They're not free of inequality, and they're not free of injustice. They're all forms of structural and annihilating realities that we have to address in the present right now and connect the dots, right? So war isn't this exceptional other space. It's actually coherent, logical, pillar of the world that we live in, right? And it's waged and funded, right, by nation states and capitalism. So we want to struggle here for we want to struggle against sexism and racism and climate change. Hey, how about also war? Wars are really easy. It's a really easy thing for most people to say, we don't want that, right? But put it alongside these other things, and then it'll show you just how potent and deadly they are too. So maybe we can connect the dots and be better fighters for a better, not necessarily a better tomorrow, but a better today.
Thanks. We've got a question from the YouTube comments, and then following that, we're going to have a question from another one of our co-editors, Carly. So from the YouTube, Zachary says, thank you for the brilliant presentation. How would you position the way that you're thinking about life in war relative to the bare and goods life distinction? Or are you uninterested in that distinction, or are you specifically rejecting it?
The what distinction?
How are you thinking about life in war relative to the bare and good life distinction?
It's a difficult question. Because the life that that most people live under conditions of war is not a good life in many ways, right? But also, who are we to say what a good life is, right? I think the question was about bare life, and I don't address that in my sort of ethnography and analysis, but I do think a lot about the good life, and I often get questions about that, saying, so what are you actually embracing? What are you actually celebrating if this is a life that is barely a life? And my response to that is that who am I to say what is a life or what is not a life? Because for those people who are living in these ravaged worlds, there's a love for the life that they lead. That is the only life that they have, right? That for me to tell them this is not a life would be a ridiculous, and privileged, maybe also racist, and completely, wrong-headed, outlook. Of course, life could be better. And that's what we should be hoping for. And they all know that life could be better, right? But within the context of their difficult lives, they have, I mean, that picture that I showed of the wedding in Galilee at the end of my presentation, this is a household that is like literally, I mean, a stone's throw from the border. And every time that a war blows through, that village gets razed to the ground. But there's so much beauty in the being in those worlds that we can't just explain away by saying that life could be better, and of course it could be, right? So it's also like it's a bit of a tension. I mean, on the one hand, we have to recognize the love that people have for their lives and their worlds, and on the other hand, we have to also recognize how their worlds could be more vitalizing, and they could have, a proliferation of more horizons. But honestly, I mean, as an anthropologist who inhabits, who's inhabited, those worlds simultaneously, often, I do see that there's a richness to living in these worlds where there's an ongoing struggle for a better today that is somehow absent of worlds where there's often too much regulation and too much luxury. So there's an interesting sort of contrast, and I don't want to romanticize at all, right? But I just want to problematize the question of what a good life is, right? And I think that that's something that should be sort of taken into consideration, especially with, as an ethnographer. And I appreciate the question.
Great, thanks. Carly, if you want to ask yours next.
Thank you, Marlena. You can hear me all right? Yes. Okay. And thank you so much, Munira, for this wonderful lecture. And again, harrowingly relevant to current events this week. You made some really thought-provoking comments in the beginning about pushing against war as other or exotic. And I was wondering if you might speak a bit more about how these narratives that you work with and critique are tied into the other points you made about the profits of war and how you explore that in your book, and how perhaps imperial or colonial powers have an interest in maintaining these depictions of otherness, which can be used to dehumanize people living through or with war, perhaps, thinking about your framework and therefore maintaining profit as one outcome. And just thinking out loud from our workshop earlier today and related to my own work, I'm thinking about the Iraq War and private military contractors and the legal protections that allow unhindered profiteering for these types of entities, and just really interested in how the points you made about profit and otherness continue to manifest in South Lebanon today. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you, Carly. And I mean, your work is extremely, important and speaks loads to the things that I'm, thinking with as well. So let me think. The othering and the exoticizing of war and those who inhabit war is something that we witnessed just in the past couple of days, right? So there's a kind of a contrast in what is acceptable to live with and through, if you're Palestinian, and what one can live with and through if one is Israeli, right? So the contrasts in the past week and the sort of proliferation of like horrible, discourse all around is an evidence to that. I mean, it's in our face, right? Some people, for many people, the fact that Palestinians live in these conditions is not at all troubling or any cause for concern. So they've kind of naturalized the fact that these are the realities that people, in Palestine and South Lebanon, in Iraq and Vietnam and Afghanistan, I mean, you name it, in the Congo, in Somalia, live with, right? Ukraine. Ukraine is actually kind of also another good example, because I mean, when the Ukraine war happened, also suddenly everybody was like astounded at the possibility of people who they related to as fellow humans and recognized as fellow humans were living through those degradations. So it's really in your face all the time, this kind of the naturalization and the of who's allowed, I mean, who lives in war and who's and the exoticization and this notion of wars happening elsewhere. And also I mean, theories of war and understandings of war and all kinds of narratives of war are often narrated from afar, mediatizations as well of war, right? So also, I mean, the images that we see about war show us kind of the images. I mean, they're like, you know, they're fixated on images of destruction and death and all that stuff that comes with it, and of course the narratives that dominate are the ones that concern you know, the agents of empire, who are often the ones who are waging wars in the first place, right? So these things are all really tied up. And in the workshop today, the person who responded to your presentation made the point that I mean, people are really anxious about climate change, but because it's climate change is sexy, but they rarely think about, you know, sort of war as a contaminated environment that anybody needs to do anything about. And I mean, they're right, you know. I mean, the point is that, I mean, who cares about war? Because those who live in war, right, are not equally human. And also those who are waging wars are usually waging them in the name of, you know, all kinds of civilizational projects, right, and democracy and freedom and all that kind of stuff. So, so in my work, I mean, I'm an anthropologist and an ethnographer, and I'm also Lebanese, and I'm also a Southerner, and I'm also, you know, a lifelong inhabitant of worlds that, technically speaking, should not be habitable, you know. And so I try to, as much as I can, in maybe a provocative way, show that you know, show the details of life within these destructive contexts. You know, I mean, when I was growing up in the what is called the Lebanese Civil War, I would watch I would watch news reports and consume sort of, you know, newspapers and magazines that were coming from abroad, often like months late, that showed the you know, that you know, represented Beirut in the 80s. And I didn't see my world in it, you know. And so as a child, I was often really struck by the discrepancies between, of course, I mean, I was living in a war, but it was a very different understanding of war than the one that is often mediatized. So there's a politics in sort of rejecting, right, the exoticization of war, because then you also, you know, if you think of war as something that is not exotic, not exceptional, and also normative to, you know, the worlds that we inhabit comfortably, you know, and sort of outspoken about wars when they take place, regardless, I mean, regardless of whether they're taking place in worlds that we consider to be acceptable or non-acceptable to war, right? So Ukraine was an easy one, right? Everyone was like, no to war. Everybody, you know, put up the flags. Europeans were opening their doors, you know, which is very, very different than what happens when, you know, wars are ongoing over generations, with millions of refugees, you know, pouring out from other worlds, right? So, so I think that there's something that it needs to be brought into the picture, even when you're sort of also engaging with it from a perspective of profit and international law, right? When you think about it from the perspective of profit, I mean, your mind explodes, right? I mean, really, it's, I mean, and the work that you do is so important in that regard. But my job, I think, is to bring out the, you know, the substance of living within these worlds that are considered uninhabitable, and by people who are considered barely human, to show that they are as human as me and you are and deserve life too, right?
Great, thank you so much. With that, we're at time, so I just want to thank you again so much for making time to be here with us today. I want to thank the other co-editors of the environment page for helping me with this, especially Camille, who helps a lot with the organization. Also, we didn't see them today, but they've been helping us through this whole process, as well as coordination over the past couple of weeks, Bassam and Lucas, who have been on the tech end of things, setting up the stream, setting up the Zoom room. So thank you guys so much for your work.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Marlena, you're amazing. Thank you all so much.
For those who have tuned in or will tune in the future, like Gabby, I plan on returning to this, so I'm grateful that we have record of it. We're always looking for submissions to the environment page, so if you have anything that you want to bring to us, feel free to send us an email at environment@jadalia.com, and we're happy to discuss that process with you. So it's been a long day. It's been a great day, and with this, I just want to say thank you to everybody one more time and release you to the rest of your afternoons and evenings. Everybody take care.
Thank you so much.